Good afternoon, everyone. It is great to see such a large audience here today for our afternoon panel. This panel is titled Directions for Democracy, a Conservative Perspective. Before we get started, the University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty in their work, educating, conducting research, supporting student access and success, and integrating indigenous knowledge, consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support, and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. One other thing that I'd like to mention is that we want to be sure you get a chance to ask questions. Here is how we'll handle that Q&A. We'll reserve the end of the discussion, and really we'll hope to get to this almost by the midpoint of our panel, for Q&A, and we're using a note card system to receive questions from the audience. You'll see on both ends, we have assistants working for that. At any time during the session, simply raise your hand to request a note card and a pencil from one of our producers. Please write legibly. If you are a student, please note this in your question on the card. And when you finish, raise your hand to hand it to the producer, who will bring it up to me. I urge everyone to please make your questions brief and to the point. And I'll now begin with an introduction to our three panelists. Patrick Deneen, at the far left, my far left. Holds a BA in English, Literature, and a PhD in Political Science from Rutgers University. From 1995 until 1997, he was a speechwriter and special advisor to the director of the United States Information Agency. And from 1997 until 2005, he was assistant professor of government at Princeton University. And from 2005 to 2012, he was the Sakopoulos Konalikas Associate Professor of Government at Georgetown University, before joining the faculty at Notre Dame in fall of 2012. He is author and editor of several books and numerous articles and reviews, and has delivered invited lectures around the world. His widely discussed 2018 book, Why Liberalism Failed, has been translated into over 20 languages and was praised by former President Barack Obama. I must add to this introduction, I heard it mentioned around the hallways this morning that there's a case to be made that Patrick is one of the most influential public intellectuals in the country today. He didn't say that about himself, though, but I will. Hadley Manning, we're very excited to have returning to CWA. She is Executive Vice President at the Steamboat Institute. As part of the leadership team, she oversees that organization's strategic vision, programs, and content. Hadley has also been a Tony Blankley Fellow at the Steamboat Institute since 2016. Previously, she worked at Independent Women's Forum and Independent Women's Voice for 15 years. She appears frequently in radio and TV outlets across the country. Her work has been featured in publications including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, and others. In 2016, Hadley was named to Forbes' 30 Under 30 list in law and policy, and in 2015, the Republican National Committee honored her as a rising star. Please join me in welcoming Hadley as well. She also lives in Denver with her husband and children. And finally, Cinamon Watson is CEO of Common Sense Institute. She began her career researching, writing, and developing policy positions in Washington, D.C. She has a rich background in strategic communications, political and policy insight, and management. Over the course of her career, Cinamon has sharpened her skills in the boardroom, on the campaign trail, and in the halls of government. And her tenure with CSI, the Common Sense Institute, began nearly a decade ago when she developed that organization's strategic communications and public infrastructure. Communications for the organization have grown to include social media platforms, podcasts, video content, membership engagement, and more than 1,800 annual earned media mentions in local, state, and national outlets. She has also played a significant role in the expansion of CSI research across the country. Please, everyone, join me in welcoming Cinamon. This panel follows on a panel that just took place in this room 20 minutes ago now at this point, in which we asked a panel of left-wing liberal thinkers to talk about the state of affairs from their perspective, the country from their perspective. And of course, this was a story of despair and concern. We now ask these same questions about the future, about optimism or fear, to a separate set of panelists who are instead considering those questions from the perspective of the right. A perspective that could be described as victorious. And indeed, the question that I have to our panelists first, and I'm going to begin at the end of the table here, is whether or not they are optimistic. And indeed, if they think that the future for the right is the future that they themselves personally wish for.
Thank you very much.
Do we have...
Slide the button up.
Garris, okay. Conservatives are anti-technology. Thank you very much, Ben, both for the invitation and for your friendship. I've been, this is toward the latter part of my year here, or 9 months here in Boulder, Colorado. I've been the Benson Center's, what is it, title? Conservative Scholar Visiting Scholar of Policy and Philosophy. It's been a great pleasure and an honor to be here, and I return very soon to the flatlands of Indiana, so I will miss the morning views from our home. Ben asked about optimism or pessimism or hopes and fears about the current moment. I think one of the fundamental differences between conservatives and liberals or progressives is that conservatives are sort of dispositionally pessimistic, and we tend to debate among ourselves not whether everything's gone to hell in a handbasket, but when it went to hell in a handbasket. And we'll have big debates whether it was 1789 or 1968 or 1066. There's lots of differences over this question. For the purposes today, I'm going to say in some ways everything went wrong for conservatism and in many ways for the nation at the moment of our triumph, at the moment of American triumph after World War II, and in particular during the years of the Cold War. And in particular, that conservatism was hollowed out and rendered in some ways its opposite under the efforts and quite extraordinarily successful efforts of a number of major thinkers that we associate with conservatism today. So I'm here on the far right because I'm a bit of a naysayer in some ways about the triumph of conservative that was forged under figures like William F. Buckley and figures associated with the National Review and the building of the conservative movement institutionally, several of the institutions being represented here, during those years of the Cold War that led then to the election of Ronald Reagan, which for many conservatives was the high watermark of conservatism. But in my view, it represents really a kind of almost the Pyrrhic victory of that which came to be known as conservatism. Under the influence and efforts of many of those architects of conservatism during and throughout the Cold War, they built something called fusionism. That may be something we talk a little bit on this panel. Fusionism was the efforts to bring together three different, you could say, members of what became the operative coalition during the Cold War and until its denouement in 1989. That three-legged stool of fusionism consisted of, we might think of them as the neoconservative hawks, represented these days by someone like the former conservative Bill Kristol, the people who were the architects of the war in Iraq. These are the very strenuously anti-communist Cold War hawks who insisted on building up the military as the fundamental way that America would, or one of the fundamental ways America would exert and exercise its power in the world. The second leg of this stool was libertarian economics. This is associated with figures like Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek, and was really, you could say, lie behind that which is under debate right now within the conservative world, among other places, whether or not we should have a globalized, flat, free market that removed as many possible restrictions and obstacles from free trade as possible. That was the second leg of the stool. The third leg of the stool were the social conservatives. These were particularly the evangelicals. Colorado Springs was like, headquarters of this. These were the social conservatives who in many ways were given the kind of task of, in many ways, emphasizing especially the role of the courts. And so a lot of the social conservatives ended up going into sort of legal studies and pushing for forms of interpretation of the Constitution, especially originalism. Justice Scalia is a good exemplar of this. So that there was a real emphasis especially on, and one way to motivate voters was especially an emphasis upon reversing Roe versus Wade. So again, we might say that conservatism shows how successful it was. It won the Cold War, it created a globalized free market economic system, and it reversed Roe versus Wade. And yet those very successes, in some ways, I regard as, in many ways, Pyrrhic victories of conservatism, because it didn't end up really conserving much of anything. In fact, I would suggest that those, in certain ways, those three commitments were more fundamentally liberal than they were conservative. They were more fundamentally, in a way, progressive than they were conservative. And above all, they represented a rejection of an older form of conservatism that I think informed America from its founding, and the founding that tends to get buried even under conservative tellings of this. The first of these is that America would be a republic and not an empire. And if you want proof of this, read the Second Amendment. I know everyone here hates the Second Amendment, or I suspect you do, but the Second Amendment was written so that we would not have a standing army, and we would not be tempted to become an imperial power. That's why it was written. That's why it says a well-regulated militia are the first four words of that amendment. It was put into the Constitution by those who feared that ambitious political figures and ambitious statesmen would wish to organize a standing army that would become then a means of extending American imperial power. So the Second Amendment is a kind of proof of the way in which, or you could say a kind of evidence of the way in which America was intended by many of its founders to be a republic and not an empire, not to become the world's policeman. Secondly, as opposed to the libertarian economics, as we are now learning again, through much of American history, American economics was understood as fundamentally nationalist economics. And tariffs are nothing new. Tariffs are very old, and in fact, the anti-tariff movement, in as much as it was conservative, comes out of that Cold War period, the effort to build a free market, flat world. Tariffs were largely to protect manufacturing and working class jobs in America. There was a working class, it was an effort to secure good work for working class people. And third, social conservatism was not limited to the courts, and in fact was backstopped by legislation that was largely the purview and domain of the states. So the states were responsible for, you could say, urging and supporting what we might think of as socially conservative kinds of values. These are things like, laws regulating marriage, laws regulating comportment, manners and morals legislation. Very old forms of thinking about manners and morals. But the more important thing is that this is not something that took place in and through court decisions. This is something that takes place as a matter of politics and a matter of negotiation and a matter of debate. And it takes into account the diverse and various ways that we think about these phenomena. By taking those debates out of the political sphere, in many ways, social conservatives sort of shot themselves in the foot in a sense. So I think right now, in an odd way, get back to Professor Teitelbaum's question, I'm cautiously optimistic in certain respects, at least in the following way, that I don't know what the future holds in terms of this administration, where it will go, but I see in many ways an effort to recall and in some ways to revive older forms of conservatism, some of which many people in this room may like, some of which you may not like, but they would include a foreign policy that's much more restrained, that doesn't seek to, as John Quincy Adams put it, doesn't seek out and destroy all the demons in the world. Secondly, an economics that's not premised on simply a completely free and open marketplace without regard to what those consequences are, especially on ordinary people and working class people. And the return of an idea of social conservatism that removes it from the courts and puts it back into, especially what I hope will be local places where we can meet face to face and talk about what it would be to strengthen families and family life in our country. And if there's one thing we might agree on, the state of family life in America is not very good, and it could really use improvement. Our children are in a bad way. They're facing a very difficult situation, and that's if we have children. So I think in those three domains, I'm actually somewhat more hopeful than I've been at any point in my working life. Thanks.
Thank you, Patrick. If we could turn to Hadley now.
Sure. Wow, it's hard to follow Patrick Deneen. This will probably be a step down from ivory tower to a little more play ball kind of politics, but insofar as a conservative is someone who, in the words of Buckley, yells stop, stands athwart history yelling stop, I do think that Trump's election to second term is a conservative victory because the direction that history seemed to be going in, especially recent history, which took a big turn due to the COVID pandemic. I mean, maybe you guys are sick of talking about the COVID pandemic, but I think we underestimate its impact on our society and our politics at our peril. I think it totally reorganized a lot of people's thoughts about their relationship to the government, and we're still watching that play out. I never thought I'd be living through a political realignment, but here we are. And I agree with much of what Patrick said. I might also say, whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic, I'm a realist. And yes, I can point to certain political outcomes that have taken place over the last couple of months and say, I like that, that's good. But I have some pretty deep concerns. One about basically every institution outside of the White House. What did Republicans win in the last election? Control of the federal government? Okay. But it seems to me as a conservative that every other major institution in our culture, including institutions like the one that we're gathered in today at university, that's not a place where that's a place where conservatives have to have like a token chair of conservative thought, okay? So I don't think that, I'm sorry, I don't mean to refer to you as a token, Patrick, but I think what I'm trying to say is in the arts, in culture more broadly, in the media. In the last panel, Manny literally sat here and said, we don't have to say what's bad that the Trump administration's doing, the media will do that. And I just about slapped my knee laughing because as a conservative, I could never say, I don't have to call out what the Obama administration's doing wrong. The media will do that. Maybe Fox News, but not the media more broadly. So I don't feel like conservatism is really winning the day in America. I think there's an administration right now that is, in a large way, a correction to some of the worst developments on the far left regarding specific social movements we can talk more about. But I think many Americans said, no, that's a bridge too far for me. I can't go for that. And we also see that Trump, in his first term and in the whole time he's been a politician, basically, has attracted a lot of people into the Republican Party who previously were totally disaffected from politics, felt totally left behind, didn't think that the left or the right was really doing anything for their interests or doing anything to appeal to them. So he's in the White House, but I'm not very optimistic in other areas of our culture. As Patrick mentioned, families. He said maybe conservatism has had some period victories, but I think liberalism in many ways also has been a victim of its own success because I look at our society and I say, okay, if you wanted a post-religion, post-family post-gender roles, post-rules society. Congratulations. I feel like we've gotten that in many ways, and it's not made a lot of people happy. It's left a lot of people with more questions than answers about their purpose. And this was also something that came up in the last panel. I don't know if you guys heard Cinamon, Patrick, but the liberals were sitting here saying, we really need to have a spiritual vision for the future. We need to come up with like a new spiritual vision. And I'm thinking, well, maybe some very old spiritual visions would be good to revisit. But ultimately, I do think the soul of our country is troubled. And that's something that weighs on me, not just as a conservative, but as an American. I sit here in front of this audience. I know a lot of people in this audience probably lean left. But I see you as my brothers and my sisters because we're all Americans and we all want what's best for our country. And during this time of political realignment, it's actually a great opportunity, I think, for us all to revisit what our core values are and what we ultimately want, what we ultimately weigh as the most important thing. I never thought that I would have to choose maybe between like freedom and virtue being the most important things, but I think that those things are actually kind of in tension on the right now. You also heard mention in the last panel of the national conservatism movement. Don't sleep on that, guys. Go read their manifesto. The national conservatism movement and the freedom conservatism movement, I would say, are good shorthand for the basic, the biggest division on the American right. And even though reading the manifestos, you might finish reading and think, well, there's a lot in common there. There is, but the differences are actually, turns out, very important right now. It's always harder, I think, to be the party that's in charge of governing. It's easier, much easier in a lot of ways to be the out party because you do get to show up and criticize basically everything. And I know that because I lived through the Obama years. And it was a great time for fundraising on the right. It was a great time to say everything's going bad. And it's easy enough to have that message, but as you're maybe in the wilderness, if you're on the left, I would just encourage you, particularly with things like the abuse of executive power, if you're concerned about that right now, please don't get amnesia about that the next time that a Democrat is in the White House. I'm concerned about it too. I like some of the political outcomes, but I'm concerned about the political processes. I am, as a limited government conservative. I think Congress needs to step up and do its job and pass legislation. But it's a much harder question. How do we get them to do that? Do we need to have term limits? Do we need to make structural changes to the way our government works? I think that's a discussion we can have, I hope, across party lines and across political affiliations and labels like that. So it's a mixed bag for me, Ben. Whether what I'm seeing makes me happy or not, I do think it's a great opportunity. And if I'm trying to be optimistic, I would say it's an opportunity for people on the right and the left to look for the common good, maybe step aside from the labels and work towards a future that's not just good laws and good government, but a healthy society where everyone feels like their life has value, where they're not a slave to their addictions, or where they're not atomized and totally lonely without friendships and community. These are big things, and I know many of them are outside of the scope of government. And I believe that because I'm a conservative. I think that so many things are outside of the scope of government. We can't use government to solve every problem. And if you're starting to feel that way too, please come join the dark side. I'll end there.
Thank you, Hadley. If we could turn to Cinamon, please, same question.
So Ben, thank you. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. Thank you to CWA. It's always a pleasure to have an excuse to come back to Boulder, my alma mater. So I spent 4 awesome years here, and it's great to be back. I am an eternal optimist at heart in everything I do, so I might be a little bit different. But I want to start by telling you a little bit about Common Sense Institute. We do believe in free enterprise, and that's the lens through which we view things. But we are also pragmatists, and we know that the problems that our nation is facing and our state can be solved when we open a dialogue that is nonpartisan. Our founders came together 15 years ago, business leaders, Chamber of Commerce, local elected officials, and said, everything's getting lost in political rhetoric. We are being governed by our emotions and not by facts, and there is a void in the political debate and in the policy realm. And so what Common Sense Institute does is we look at all of the issues facing our local states, our local communities, and we measure those against jobs in the economy. We look at facts, we look at data. For instance, in education, we look at educational outcomes. We look at what spending per pupil is. We don't make decisions, but we do bring people together. I would say about half of our policy fellows are Democrat and half are Republican. Maybe it's a third, and a third with independent. But we do believe that political viewpoints have to come from different sides of the aisles to solve the problems that we're facing. And that's the pragmatic side. And I think that's where we have achieved success over the last number of years on everything from affordable housing to education to energy. And so that's where I stand. I think we are better if we work together, and that's where the eternal optimist lies within me. I think that we have such a huge political realignment going on in this country that the more that we can talk together and rely on the facts and get rid of the rhetoric, the better we'll be. And so that's the practical side of where I sit.
So when I listen to these three opening statements, the question of a sort of life and a political fate and destiny that lies outside of electoral politics is mentioned by a number of you. I hear this most clearly when you referred to the previous panel, Hadley, and you said and you referred to our local representative who was saying that yes, the media can do part of this work for us. The subtext of that being, yeah, elections may have outcomes. You may have a government sitting in power, but there's another order that exists in the populace. Do you think that order is going to change? Is there movement there too? Cinamon, you mentioned that there's a sort of a tectonic shift to politics right now. We know that Trump is in the White House. We know who's in control of the Supreme Court, who's in control of Congress. Who do you think is in control of the demos, and how are they changing to any of you?
I might jump in and just say, throughout my adult lifetime, I started in college as a journalism major. I thought I wanted to be a journalist. But I very quickly realized that the field of journalism was changing, and I didn't know if I really wanted to be a part of it anymore. You know, I was concerned that with the rate of change in technology and the direction of new media, we used to call it, now it's all media seems to be new media, I just didn't know where the field was going, and so I took another direction with my career. But the rate of change has just gotten faster and faster, and you might say it's a democratization of media because we have moved away from the influence of legacy media. The big major newspapers lost the trust of a lot of people, and they have turned to other sources of information. Many people get their information and their news from social media channels now, from YouTube, from individual influencers on TikTok. I would venture to say that most young people go to those sources of information before they turn on a network television show or read a legacy newspaper. Whether or not you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, I think there's pros and cons. I think there's risks to that approach because whom can we trust? You know, that's the question. If there's misinformation out there, who should be the arbiter of that? It's created quite a headache for, I think, many people who are just trying to navigate and find out what are the facts. And this has complicated our politics to the degree that we no longer have debates using the same set of facts. And we, in many ways, live in alternate realities, even in places that might be very diverse. When we turn these on, we get sucked back into, in many ways, our echo chambers. So I would encourage people, and this is where I might give a shameless plug, if that's okay, Ben. The Steamboat Institute is working very hard against this, and one of the major programs that we're doing in this regard is hosting debates. We're actually hosting a debate here at CU tomorrow night, 5:30 at the Touchdown Club, if you guys want to come. But we are we put a lot of emphasis on civility, fair debate, substantive debate, because we feel like this is a big thing that's missing from our body politic. Of course, there's debates before every election, and the candidates come and yell at each other, and they volley talking points at one another, but the exchange of ideas, that's what we want to provide with this platform. So you can go to steamboatinstitute.org and learn more about our debates. However, the bigger challenge is getting people to get outside of those echo chambers in the media that they consume. And I don't have the answer, because I think that we all have confirmation bias working in us. Our brains have ego defense mechanisms. We don't want to encounter information that suggests that our narrative is wrong. How do we combat that? I don't know. I think the first step maybe is being aware of it and trying to have people in our social circles who think differently from us. But it's a major challenge politically and in our society more broadly.
Any other comments on that? That first question, a common phrase, has been a common phrase among conservatives for a number of years, was that, and this comes from Andrew Breitbart, although there are plenty of sources for it, was that politics is downstream from culture. And therefore, you had better change the culture before you change politics. And someone might look at our situation now and say that, well, the cart has come before the horse.
Yeah, I guess I'll tackle that.
No small question.
No, it turns out, so this has actually been a mantra of conservatives for a long time. The idea being that conservatives ought and must focus on shifting and changing the culture to make the culture more friendly to conservative values, because the assumption is that culture is downstream of politics, but this also reflects the kind of anti-government presuppositions that have animated conservatism since the kind of Cold War fusion formulation. At the heart of that formulation, aside from military power, there's a deep mistrust of public and political and governmental power. And it's reflected, for example, in the libertarian economics, free market economics. It's reflected in the arguments that you encounter in Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek, libertarian economists, that governments, in a sense, are always operating under limited information, and therefore they can only govern badly. Better to have no government at all and let people sort of determine their own fates and their own futures. And this is so, it's not just an empirical claim that culture is downstream of politics, it's a philosophical claim that culture ought to be downstream, politics ought to be downstream of culture, that the bottom-up wisdom of the many can then reorient politics and not vice versa. But I think what we're actually seeing is that the opposite might in fact be more true than conservatives have believed. It's more true in the following sense. Why are the institutions that we were just mentioning, and we can talk about another one in addition to journalism, universities? Why are universities overwhelmingly on the left? Not just a little bit, massively, overwhelmingly, by huge percentages. And how much of that has things to do with things like government funding and the emphasis of that government funding, and the way in which government approval or public approval can shift and shape and influence the views of those within those institutions? It's not the only reason, but it's a partial reason. And it's a reason that conservatives have ignored at their own peril. And notice what happened when Donald Trump was elected on this kind of anti-woke, partly anti-woke agenda. How many institutions suddenly shifted and said, we're not doing the woke thing anymore, either because it's going to be enforced from the government or we want to get out ahead of it. We're going to disassemble our DEI movement. We're going to disassemble this particular woke agenda. In other words, it turns out that politics can have a pretty powerful shaping effect on what we think of as this autonomous or independent culture. They don't operate one being downstream of the other. They're both mutually reinforcing. And so I think one of the things that's maybe shocking, not only to people on the left, but to a lot of people on the right, is to have a shift, not just in coalitions, but in a worldview in which increasingly conservatives, people in this more populist moment, have a much more positive view toward the possibilities of what political power can and ought to be doing. And in this sense, I think this is, we may disagree with how it's being used and the way it's being used, but this is a positive, in my view, a positive development within conservatism, because it means that we're no longer arguing, is government good or bad? We're going to be, in many ways, debating what policies are good and what policies are bad, what ends are good and what ends are bad. And I think that puts us on a more honest footing than I would think what has been the case in American politics for a long time.
I can jump in with a question for Cinamon, and this is from the audience. This will start our questions from the audience. What do you think is the solution to affordable housing? You said that your institute has ideas for this.
Yes. So we have a series of studies that we have done looking at both the need and some of the regulatory infrastructure. We've worked with people on the left, people on the right, people in the middle, people that have experienced difficulty in finding affordable housing. And so I will talk a little bit about some of the victories we've had in, say, City of Denver. We provided some facts on the regulatory infrastructure. Legislators picked up on that. They have looked at some changes in, for instance, apartment buildings having 2 stairwells. Very expensive, just have 1 stairwell for 8-unit building. Makes it much more affordable for those that live there. So looking at the permitting process, things of that nature, sound small, but they go a long way. Construction defects you may have heard of in the Colorado legislature has been debated over and over and over again. And finding a solution to what constitutes a lot of litigation if there's a problem has been a big study of ours as well. But you can find all the studies at commonsenseinstituteco.org. Another shameless plug.
There you go.
Okay, I thought just reading the room, it's fairly quiet out in the audience, and I thought there wouldn't be any questions, but I'm drowning at the moment, so I'm going to move fairly quickly through these. I hear from all of you that free enterprise is of utmost importance. I did not hear anything about the role of science. I'll leave that to whoever would like to take it up. Did you all say that free enterprise is of utmost importance, by the way?
I think it's of utmost importance that we
freedom.
destroy it, yes.
Free enterprise is the lens through which we view a lot of things. And we do determine, we develop our studies based on facts and data. And so science of data, yes, plays a significant role.
Yeah, I guess I'll take a stab at this because, of course, I think a narrative has developed that the left is the pro-science party, the right is the anti-science party, and there may be some truth to that, but no scientist will ever make the following statement: the science is settled.
Right.
No scientist who calls themselves a scientist will ever say the science is settled, and yet this is what I hear constantly from progressives: the science is settled. The science is settled. Climate change is caused by this. Now, I'm willing to acknowledge, yeah, there's lots of data right now that indicate, this aspect and that aspect. But anyone who uses this phrase, the science is settled, ought to eliminate that from their vocabulary. The second aspect of the science debate is less about the science than what are the implications and policy implications that we draw from what we might regard as science that seems to be relatively settled at the moment. And here I think many people on the left, especially when it comes to climate issues, among other things, or COVID issues, to go back to, have concluded that once you have the scientific findings, the policy is obvious. And that's far from the case. That's far from the case. In fact, this is where it seems to me we need to have robust debate over what the implications are, what the policy implications are. So I think that the mantra about follow the science or the science is settled is less obvious than many people tend to think. And again, I would like for this debate to be put on a genuine and an honest footing, which is that there's not a party of science and a party of anti-science. There's a party that draws one set of implications from the contemporary science and policy proposals and policy recommendations, and there's another party that draws other conclusions from that. Now, is the left entirely accountable for this? No, of course not, because there are people on the right who are in this mindset, well, we just have to deny this. But I think there are many honest people and people of goodwill on the right who would have legitimate debates about what are the implications and what follows, what are the potential policies that follow from this, that, or the other set of findings. So,
I haven't gotten through all these yet. Everyone's looking at me. Goodness. Okay. Let me take a clump of questions that come from the audience that all relate to the same basic theme. I'll read some of them. Are honesty and rule of law conservative values? If so, please evaluate conservative politicians' performance. Do you think the Trump administration aligns with conservative values? If you are a Christian, is there any way that Donald Trump follows the teachings of Christ and the Gospels? And we'll close it up with a student. JFK said in a 1961 speech, "There is little of value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it." How have conservatives capitalized on saving our traditions like family values and gender roles?
Where would you like us to start, Ben?
I'm like,
That's a lot.
I was kind of playing, I was just disappearing from the stage.
Yeah.
I will tell you that setting a few of those things aside, throughout my career I have worked with a number of elected officials, worked for them, worked with them on different policy issues, and to a person, whether you agree or disagree with them, these are people that are putting their hat in the ring to solve problems that are important to all of us. And they are challenges that we all face. And so hats off to those that do put their hat in the ring and run. I think, again, a lot of the questions, with all due respect, have a lot of rhetoric and spin. And I think that it is important for us to look at the policy challenges that we're facing in our local communities. What the average family is paying in taxes, for instance. Is housing affordable? Where are we getting our energy from? Those are the problems that are going to make, solving those problems are going to be the things that make us better as a community, better as a nation, better as a state. I will say that one of my favorite fellows that we have at Common Sense Institute looked at me one day and he really wanted to address and quantify the cost of young people that age out of the foster system. They come out of the foster system with little to nothing and no support. He's like, you know, if we can support those kids, what does that do for our society? If we can provide them the tools that they need. And it may be as simple as finding a way to get them their high school transcripts from the 6 different high schools they've gone to so they can apply for college. What he said about the problem is this is something we can solve, and this is where we have to be pragmatic. We need to rely on the data and look at what this is going to do for our community. And I think it's pretty easy to get caught up in the rhetoric and the spin, and I would encourage you to think about your local community, think about the challenges that we can solve, and some of the issues that we can have a positive impact on.
Yeah, actually, I want to go back to an interesting moment when you were mentioning the need for Congress to legislate, and there was an
Applause.
outpouring of applause.
Yeah, thanks,
I mean,
guys.
there was like, you had the room with you. You know,
Right.
you could have run for
ran with
office
that,
right
yeah.
there. Yeah, and that was striking to me because if that were the widespread view, a massively widespread view on the left and the right in the American citizenry, I think we would see something remarkable happen, which is that we would begin to vote for legislators on the basis of whether or not they were passing legislation, whether Congress was doing their job. But that's not what we're doing. We are more than happy when our political figure, the leader of our party, is in charge and uses executive orders to advance the agenda of the party. When Obama was president, he said, I have a pen. I have a telephone and a pen, but I have a pen. Right. I can use the pen simply to write executive orders. This is the way in which the American government has functioned for approximately the last 50 years. The executive issuing executive orders and Congress effectively not governing. Now, why is that? That is because all of us are engaged in a system, and the left and the right are both accountable for this, which we have all, in a sense, consented to the increasing centralization of government. This is true on the left, of course. More and more government functions are seen as only legitimate if it's in the federal government. We remove more and more of those from the states. It's also the case on the right. The militarization of our society, the massive amount that we spend on defense, this has led to the centralization of so much of our country. I lived in DC, was mentioned I used to teach at Georgetown. The wealthiest counties, the 10 wealthiest counties in the country, are in and around, it's not even Boulder, they're in and around Washington, DC. Now, why is that? What are they producing? What great product is Washington, D.C., Northern Virginia, Southern Maryland producing? They're producing power. And of course, they're producing pork. Right, so, yeah, not in the Colorado sense. So we have the massive centralization of power, which now is effectively run out of the Oval Office. If we as citizens really wanted Congress to legislate, it wouldn't just be we'd be voting for Congress people to legislate. We would have to have a real, thoughtful national conversation about what is the nature of the political order in the United States. And the only plausible way to have a Congress that's going to be more accountable and that's going to do its job is to have more power, more locally, and so that Congress can do its job, and that the president becomes much less important, and therefore every national election becomes less important. I think probably every single one of us would agree to this, no matter what we might think about Donald Trump in particular, or Barack Obama in particular, or Joe Biden in particular. I think every one of us would agree with it, and from some of the reaction, maybe there's a growing sense that we do need to reorient the national political project.
So we have a student question. I'd like to turn to some student questions, and this one relates to students, or at least people the age of students. Why do you think that young people, age 18 to 26, voted for Trump in such high numbers? And why do you think women of color were the outlier in this demographic?
I think some of it with the young people has to do with the sense of rebellion that comes naturally to young people. I mean, what is the most outrageous thing you can do today? It's like, be a conservative, you know, like.
Wear a red baseball hat.
Yeah, wear a red baseball hat. Good luck. Good luck with that. Depending on where you live, you know. This gets back to something else, you know, when we start talking about slicing the electorate into demographic groups. The Republican Party is now also the party of the working class. We're the party of people, the lesser educated of the two parties, right? The highly educated Americans are very concentrated inside the left. And I find these changes fascinating. I think they reflect some of the realignment that we've been talking about. I mean, Kamala Harris is a woman of color. So I would say, similar to the election of Barack Obama, you saw a lot of people of color understandably very excited to have a president who looked like them and represented their community and in some ways their interests. And so I would credit sort of identity politics, I guess. It's kind of, that sounds like a bad term. I don't mean it in a bad way. I just think people vote for people that they think, hey, this person might carry forth they look like me. They come from where I come from, worldview-wise, right? And certainly among this group, 18 to 26-year-old women of color, the political leaning is left. So that makes sense. You know, it's not like you have a conservative demographic group switching across party lines based on who the candidate is. But young people in general, as I mentioned, they're getting their news from different places. They're open. In our experience taking debates to college campuses, these kids are so excited to have a debate on their campus. They're so excited to hear both sides and to really engage with, I mean, personally, college was a very formative time for me. I was questioning everything. And so during that time, people are very open to messages from either side. But I do think some of it has to do with, yeah, the progressive movement was very strong 10, 15 years ago. And now that's like middle-aged white women, you know, are kind of like the Karens, the standard bearers of like the Democratic Party. It's not cool anymore the way that it used to be. And I never thought that I would be saying that, because as a young conservative 10, 15 years ago, I thought that I was signing up for a life of being uncool, you know? And I still think that there's a lot to be desired in terms of coolness on the right. But I do think that young people in some ways were looking at Trump as someone who was going to make the correction, change course. They saw Kamala Harris, as much as she tried to paint herself as something different and new, she was the sitting vice president. She was essentially going to continue the same policies in the same direction that Joe Biden had instituted during his presidency. And it was hard to, I think, as late in the game as she became the candidate. It was Joe Biden for a long time, and he's very far away from young people, not just in terms of age, but culturally. I mean, he just didn't connect with that group of voters.
Something I just want to, if I can jump in as a moderator here, because we're talking about the appeal of conservative ideas to different groups. Perhaps you have heard something already in our conversation that surprised you, that perhaps you assumed was not a conservative position, but you have heard a self-identifying conservative voice it here. We already heard one that would have surprised me, I think, a number of years ago, and that was Patrick Deneen saying that you want to destroy free markets. Am I quoting you correctly?
I think I said it like 2 minutes ago.
Free enterprise, he said, yeah.
Yes, free enterprise, excuse me.
Yeah.
To destroy free enterprise. And I wonder about if we're always taking into account how much cross-generational scrambling positions like that might produce, because you don't hear a lot of young people singing the praises of free markets these days. And if you hear someone come out and criticize free markets, surely that upends some of their political affiliations and sympathies.
Yeah, my students today divide between right anti-free markets or free enterprise and left anti-free enterprise, and they're surprised to discover a commonality on that. And look, I mean, of course, I'm a believer. I think probably almost everyone in this room is at some level is a believer in markets. I mean, the Boulder free market is fantastic. I'm sorry, the Boulder farmers market is fantastic. High prices, but nevertheless, we can negotiate. At some level, we all believe in markets, but increasingly on the right, the real question is, in what ways, shape, and forms are markets serving the purpose of the common good, and in what ways are they undermining the purpose of the common good? Now, the common good is can be a vague and sometimes vacuous phrase, but if we begin to plug in some substantive claims, at least from the perspective of conservative, how are ordinary working class people doing under the globalized free enterprise system that was established over the last 50 years? You know, J.D. Vance is the kind of primary example of someone growing up in the midst of a devastated Midwest Appalachia. I teach in South Bend, Indiana, a city that used to be fabulous, used to be beautiful, used to be one of the gems of the Midwest, and absolutely and utterly devastated as we moved it through the 20th century. How are families supporting stability and order in communities, traditional forms of life, the ability of not just of wealthy people who live here in Boulder to have really wonderful community, but ordinary people, working class people, and otherwise not as wealthy communities to have stability, to have the expectations that their children can do at least as well as they're doing, and not fall behind, not be able to buy a house, and so forth. And on these measures, we have to say that the globalized economic system that was established over the last 50 years has not been serving that end particularly well. It's been pooling the money in smaller and smaller number of pockets. And so the realignment that we're seeing is actually, I would say, a kind of conservative realignment, even though it might seem like it betrays some of the basic commitments of 80s, 60 through 80s conservatism. Its core concern isn't just to have a free market or a free enterprise system. Its core concern is, do we have a society that's conserving good things and not destroying those good things? And part of the consideration has to be, how are we structuring our markets in such ways that will be supportive of those forms of life that can be available not just to the well-off, but to the ordinary fellow citizens who aren't beneficiaries of the kinds of education, the kinds of jobs that many of us in this room have been able to enjoy.
I definitely want to let Cinamon chime in because she'll speak up in favor of free enterprise, I imagine. But I am sitting here thinking that there's an analogy, and just as markets are very valuable, a market economy is very valuable and can solve a lot of problems, science also can solve a lot of problems, scientific advancements, medical advancements, absolutely. But markets, like science, cannot solve every problem. And both of these, the pursuit of scientific inquiry and research, as well as the pursuit of more prosperity, or you might say abundance, which can only be created by free markets, is good insofar as it's combined with some governing virtues. I was reading in my Bible recently, I was struck that in the book of Ruth, the men were kind of leaving extra sheaths of wheat for Ruth to come pick up. They didn't glean their fields to entirety. They didn't scrape every last drop up in the name of maximizing profit. And so, yes, a free market economy is something I believe in very deeply because I believe it is a huge engine of wealth creation that can reduce poverty and provide great innovations. It's improved our lives tremendously. If you map out economic freedom around the world, it's pretty clear that that's also where prosperity and development have taken place around the world. But I think we also have to have a virtuous society that is deserving of the freedom that comes with a government that is small. So if we're not going to have a big government, we have to be able to self-govern, and we have to have the moral compass to tell us, for a long time and throughout history, Americans have been the most generous people in the world. They have given more to charity than any other country. This is a beautiful, wonderful thing about America, and I think it also says something about how we have a limited government safety net, so we depend on charitable institutions to fill the gap, depend on our churches to fill the gap, or we hope that there's some combination of those things that can help people with a hand up rather than a handout. This is all really good about America, but if you focus on free market economies separate from or absent from some sense of social responsibility, and I'm not talking about social responsibility in terms of government-imposed social responsibility. I'm talking about just having the goal of improving society, which so many capitalists and business owners do have. That's necessary, I think, for the market to provide something good to people, that it's not just about soaking every last cent of profit, but it's about providing goods and services to other people in a free exchange so that we all become better off. And that's ultimately why I like free enterprise, but I understand that, like science, it doesn't answer every question and solve every problem.
Ditto.
Okay.
Yes, we believe strongly in free enterprise and individual opportunity. That American entrepreneurialism is what drives so many of the advancements we see in medicine, in technology. It's why we have such a thriving, or can have such a thriving economy, and we want to make sure that all individuals have the opportunity and access to that.
Mm-hmm. So we'll try to be efficient. There are more questions than we can deal with here. Here are a couple. This makes me think actually about your opening pre-comments, Patrick, when you said conservatives don't like technology. This is from a high school student. We love to have high school students here at CWA. And I'm going to read two questions before we answer. Here's the first one from the high school student. How is Musk's presence in the White House constitutional? And I might add to that, how is Musk's presence in the White House an emblem of conservative politics? Second question. Free trade gets blamed for the decline in the economic status of working people. What about automation? And what do conservatives think about AI?
All right. Do you want to answer the Musk question?
Sure.
You go for that. I got stuff to say about AI and automation, but I'll let you go first and talk about Musk.
Okay.
I'm like,
Yeah, so it's, of course, an interesting question. I joked when I was trying to turn on this microphone that conservatives are anti-technology. Here's another good example in which you have I think, a signature divide between those I would describe as more traditional conservatives and libertarians. And notice how someone like Musk, or people generally in the Silicon Valley world, we might call them conservatives, although that would be an odd thing maybe to call Musk the father of like 17 children by 15 different women, most of which is in vitro fertilization. Is that like support or okay? At any rate, it would be odd to call him a conservative, but we have noticed how we've over the last 50 years we've elided and in many ways combined this term conservative with libertarian. And part of my entire life's project is to make sure that we don't make that confusion anymore, because libertarians are not conservatives. In fact, if you want proof of this, go and read two essays of the same title, one by Milton Friedman and one by Friedrich Hayek, great supporters of free enterprise. Both of them wrote essays titled, Why I Am Not a Conservative. They knew there was a difference between being a libertarian and a conservative. But that's been widely forgotten in the way in which politics has kind of jumbled these terms together. So conservatives tend to be very anguished about a lot of technology, because technology, of course, disrupts. Technology transforms, and often transforms in very wrenching ways. It upends existing orders. It destroys existing orders. It destroys forms of work. It destroys ways of life. If you want a good exemplar of a conservative worldview toward technology, read the farmer, author, poet Wendell Berry. One of my favorite thinkers. Someone who doesn't necessarily describe himself as a conservative, but when he speaks about community, the fabric of community, the need to sustain and to be a trustee and the bearer of a community's values from generation to generation, that is the fundamental definition of a conservative worldview. Tradition means to pass on, to pass something from one generation to the next. So conservatives, by their kind of essence, have a kind of agonized relationship with the thing we call technology, not because we're anti-technology, farming is a technology, but because of the implications and consequences and effects of much of technology. And of course, we live in a time when that technology is disruptive and transformative, AI, automation being good examples of this. And this would be one area where I think we might have some disagreements among the conservative tribe. Those of a more libertarian bent will be of the view, let all technology roll, let the chips fall where they may. That's the source of innovation. I'm not saying that you necessarily, but many of my interlocutors. My own view would be that the public good and the common good and the public order have to have a say in how we think about and how we allow this technology in many ways to unfold in our lives. And we're seeing this happening now with schools and school districts, including, I know this from the Boulder Camera, I am a subscriber, that Colorado schools are considering or perhaps have passed legislation banning the use of cell phones in schools. I think that's a positive and a good thing. Right? So it's not simply that we want to stop technology, but we need to think about the responsible ways that a civilization uses, allows, permits, and ultimately will utilize that technology. This is a case in which politics and culture, it seems to me, ought to be working closer hand in hand, but because I think we've had this worldview drummed into us that technology is autonomous of our human capacity to govern ourselves. It's this autonomous entity that has its own life, that has its own will, right? That has, and Musk speaks about it this way. Technology is its own phenomenon that I really think that if we want to be a self-governing human civilization, we have to be able to think, reflect, and organize ourselves around ideas that technology is simply one of our tools that we govern. I'm sorry, I don't mean to go on at great length here, but just one last thing about Musk and whether or not he's a conservative. Of course, as I said, he's not a conservative, but he is affecting one of the core aspects that conservatives have been desirous of for many, many years, which are reducing the size and scope and activity of the federal government, some of which a lot of people will like, some of which a lot of people won't like. But when you applauded that we should have Congress do what Congress does and not have as much power in the executive, well, where is the power in the executive? It's in the bureaucracy. That's the executive branch, is the bureaucracy. So if you don't like the executive having all this great centralized power, then you ought to be as suspicious about the expanse, size, and scope of the bureaucracy as many conservatives have been over for many years. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Should I talk about automation for a second? Okay, well, I'll start with a transition from what Patrick said, which will probably ruffle a lot of feathers. But I have to say it, one huge technology that changed our world and has had so many implications, some positive and some negative, was the introduction of birth control. Okay, this is a technological advancement, and I think you would be denying some part of reality if you didn't acknowledge that it has come with benefits and some consequences. Consequences to family formation, to the relationships between men and women, and certainly to our fertility rate. And our fertility rate is a huge issue. It's a huge issue. I'm in favor of more people, okay? And for that reason, I'm also in favor of immigration. I think we need immigrants in this country. They fill important gaps in our labor market, but they also bring a lot of interesting, diverse perspectives, cultures. I love that we're a melting pot. I hope that we still are a melting pot. I say that because I love the diversity that immigration brings, but I also believe in some level of cultural assimilation, at least to the point where you have to accept Western liberal values. At least you have to believe that every person is equal and should get equal rights. So if you can support that and you can come to the country and follow the laws, then great. I love that. However, I don't think that immigrants are the number one reason that maybe, and I don't even think that free trade is the number one reason that some blue-collar jobs have been hollowed out in this country. A big part of it is also automation. And automation is great because I think, Milton Friedman, to quote a bad guy, he's actually, I don't think a bad guy, but he said, we could dig a hole with spoons, or we could dig a hole with a shovel and be a lot more effective. You could create a lot of jobs by giving every worker a spoon, but by using a shovel, you've got fewer jobs, but you're more productive and more efficient. So yes, technological changes come with pros and cons to our lives. AI is one that I believe is going to do to many white-collar jobs what some of the more physical automation advancements have done to blue-collar jobs. And what that means for our politics is yet to be seen. I think it's going to be incredibly disruptive. I think, like the other technological advancements that I've mentioned, it's going to be really big, and it's going to come with upsides and downsides, and how we weather that is going to determine a lot about the future, not just of our politics, but our society, our interpersonal relationships, and our feelings about the future.
So I think we need to close. There are two related questions I'd like to pose, and I would ask our panelists to be very, very brief, if you would, in your remarks. Why are all of you afraid to disagree with Trump? I feel like I am in Russia. It seems that unique, independent thought within the Republican Party has been gutted out of deference to Trump. Do you agree? And what is the long-term impact on the party?
Yeah, I'll get to be brief. I don't think there's, if you speak any period of time with me, you'll find I have no compunction about disagreeing with various aspects of Trump or being critical of Trump, and I suspect that's probably true of all of us. But when you're faced with, I compare it a little bit to like when I studied in Ireland when Ronald Reagan was president. And every Irish person at Trinity College began every conversation, isn't Ronald Reagan the worst human being ever to have lived? And, okay, agree or disagree, but as an American attempting to represent in some way, shape, or form my own fellow citizens, I would always begin the conversation with, well, let's think about the ways in which the American people supported Ronald Reagan. I didn't personally vote for Ronald Reagan, right? I was not necessarily Republican, but in order to help explain to people who were just viscerally filled with hate toward that political figure, I felt it was something of my responsibility to explain to people, well, maybe there's not entirely irrational reasons why people have supported this person. And I feel a little bit like that when I'm confronted by the kinds of questions, some of which had that kind of animus lying behind them. So I don't think, and I don't know if I'm speaking for everyone here, I don't think any of us would be the sort of person who's not capable, and indeed probably often engages in criticisms of Donald Trump or the Trump administration. But I'm sure they would be very different. I'm sure they'd have different valences. My own criticism is that he shouldn't get rid of the Department of Education and NEH and NEA because he should turn them into conservative organizations. That's my view. Right? You shouldn't get rid of them. So that would be my first critique, is stop dismantling the government. Turn it into our side. Right? Program it with our stuff. Right? So this is where I disagree with my libertarian friends. So yeah, I'll be critical of Donald Trump and Trumpism in lots of ways. But I think that when you're presented with the kinds of challenges that often come from a place of there is no possible way in the world that anyone could say anything good about this administration, well, maybe it's our responsibility at some level to begin to try to explain to people why maybe some of your fellow citizens voted for him.
I'm not afraid to disagree with Donald Trump. I think a lot of my disagreements with him, y'all don't want to hear about, okay? He says he doesn't want to mess with Social Security and Medicare. I say, let's bring Paul Ryan back, okay? I was ready to do that. I don't like that Donald Trump basically messed up the conservative effort to reform, you could say repeal and replace, Obamacare. I think Donald Trump was totally wrong about that. I think Donald Trump is not, as pro-life as I am personally. So my disagreements with him are going to be on the right side. I think, why don't you guys agree with him more about the things that he's more centrist on? I mean, truly, you should not allow someone as the leader of, your side or your political movement to talk you into departing from your principles, but you also should not allow the political opposition to define your positions on things, right? I don't like it when my liberal friends seem to have new ideas basically based on the two-party system and how we're always playing a zero-sum game with one another. We don't have to do that, guys, and I'm certainly not afraid to disagree with Donald Trump. I said, I like immigration, I like free trade. Those are some things that Trumpism seems to be more critical of. However, I mentioned at the outset that some of the outcomes from this administration I'm pleased with, so I'm just trying to call the balls and strikes. It's a difficult time for that, but that's the best we can do.
I would say, no, I'm not afraid to disagree with Donald Trump. I don't love everything he's done. I don't hate everything he's done. What will this do to the Republican Party long term? Don't know, but we're going to find out in 3 years when he's not on the ballot. And
J.D. Vance will be the. I think
but we don't know. We don't know
mantle
that.
bearer.
We don't know that. Say it's 4 years, 8 years. We don't know what's going to happen to the Republican Party. What I see in voter registration numbers, particularly here in Colorado, a huge growing independent registration. Both parties have dropped in their registration levels. I think people are voting on issues. People will always vote for a person, but I think they are looking at issues. Nobody wants to align with the two-party system. Are we seeing a total realignment and a shift in the way Americans vote? Maybe. It's kind of an exciting time to watch if you've been a student of history. So time will tell.
But thank you for the question, whoever
Yes.
asked, so we could clarify. I'm not afraid to disagree with Donald Trump. If I were, I'd be pursuing like an administration job, I guess.
And thank you for all the questions, everybody. This was a wonderful panel. Thank you, and continue your time at CWA.